He rolled onto that Birmingham stage like he owned it. Black throne, crooked smile, hands shaking just enough to remind everyone that time was real, but not in charge. July 5th wasn't billed as a farewell. It was framed as a homecoming, a noise-soaked thank you to the city that taught him how to survive by getting louder. Fans felt the charge, the shiver that says, "Pay attention, this matters," without realizing why. 17 days later, they would. What looked like another improbable comeback turned out to be the last roar of a man who'd spent 5 decades turning chaos into currency. If you've ever wondered how a poor kid from Aston became the spirit of heavy metal, why the world is still arguing over how to honor him, and what happens to a genre when its loudest heartbeat finally stops, the story isn't clean. It never was. That's why it hits so hard. John Michael Osbourne learned early that silence didn't help. 6 kids cramped into a tiny house, a dad pulling night shifts, a mom juggling a dozen part-time jobs. Nobody had room for delicate feelings. School and Ozzy never got along. Dyslexia and bullies made sure of that. Petty thefts, a short stint behind bars, and more odd jobs than he could count filled the gaps before the music found him. When Tony Iommi published that Singer Wanted ad, he didn't get a polished frontman. He got a voice that sounded like a haunted factory siren. Black Sabbath was born out of boredom, damp rehearsal spaces, and riffs that felt like the weight of a steel mill crashing down. Ozzy didn't sing like he was trained. He sang like he was exercising something. The band made heavy metal by accident, tuning down to make Iommi's injured fingers hurt less, writing lyrics that sounded like the headlines nobody talked about at dinner. Paranoid, Iron Man, War Pigs. These weren't songs built for radio. They were warnings carved into amplifiers. And at the center was Ozzy, eyes wide, hands flailing, voice cutting through like a rusted bell. He wasn't charismatic because he practiced. He was charismatic because nothing about him could be contained. That unpredictability became the show. Every note a question, every scream an answer. The misfit finally found a volume knob big enough to drown out the noise in his own head. Success doesn't cure self-destruction. It just gives it a nicer tour bus. By the end of the 70s, Sabbath was exhausted, and Ozzy was a tornado of missed rehearsals, chemical fog, and vanishing acts. They kicked him out in 1979. For most singers, that's the end. For Ozzy, it was the weird beginning. He disappeared into a hotel room and started what he later called his slow-motion exit. Enter Sharon Arden, sharp, stubborn, and unwilling to let Ozzy rot. She yanked him back to daylight, assembled a new band around a teenage guitar prodigy named Randy Rhoads, and bet on a solo record everyone predicted would flop. Blizzard of Oz didn't flop. It detonated. Crazy Train wasn't just a hit, it was a mission statement. Jagged, catchy, and unmistakably Ozzy. Follow-ups like Diary of a Madman proved it wasn't luck. The voice, the swagger, the weird charm, it all translated. Being fired from Sabbath didn't end his story. It split it in two. Now he wasn't just a heavy metal frontman, he was the headline, the circus, and the ringmaster all rolled together. And behind the curtain, Sharon kept tightening the bolts, so the whole thing didn't fly apart mid-show. Ozzy didn't rebrand himself, he just kept being himself, louder, messier, and somehow more focused than ever. By the early 80s, Ozzy had a talent for accidentally writing his own press releases with live animals and bad decisions. The dove he bit at a record label meeting was supposed to be a peace gesture, until nerves and impulse took over. The bat on stage? He thought it was rubber. The Alamo arrest? He was wearing Sharon's dress and running on fumes. Each stunt sent the newspapers straight to the press. Here's what kept people from turning on him. He never pretended it hadn't happened. Years later, in interviews, he'd shrug and say, "Yeah, I was off my head." That honesty, no legalese, no PR spin, became part of the brand whether he liked it or not. He wasn't untouchable, he was breakable in front of you. He messed up, paid for it, and kept moving. In a world full of curated rock gods, Ozzy stayed delightfully uncurated. The volatility wasn't a marketing plan, but it was magnetic. Audiences didn't just want to hear Mr. Crowley, they wanted to see if the guy singing it would still be upright by the guitar solo. It sounds morbid, but it was human. A collective rooting interest in someone who refused to mask his damage. And that constant confession, "I did it. I blew it. I'm trying again. Built a kind of loyalty you can't fake. Sharon Osbourne isn't a side character in this story. She's the co-architect. When the 90s rolled in and most classic metal acts were either nostalgia acts or in denial, she threw Ozfest onto the calendar. Picture it, a touring festival dedicated to the heavy music establishment said was dead. Slipknot, System of a Down, Pantera, Korn, bands that couldn't get the big festival slots suddenly had a stage and a rabid built-in audience. Ozzy headlined, sure, but he also played Godfather, handing the mic to the next wave. Then came television. The Osbournes on MTV turned the first family of metal into prime-time chaos. Dogs, swearing, half-finished sentences, constant bleeping. America tuned in and discovered Ozzy as a confused, funny, unexpectedly gentle dad who couldn't work the remote. Overnight, suburban parents who hated his music were quoting his mumbling. The show could have wrecked his image. Instead, it humanized him. The Prince of Darkness also loved his kids, forgot where he put the TV remote and said Sharon 40 times an episode. Reinvention isn't just about sound. Sometimes it's about letting people see the mess. And once again, Sharon steered the ship, balancing business with the bizarre, keeping Ozzy in the spotlight without burning him alive in it. Decades of leaping off speaker stacks and hammering his nervous system came at a price. A serious accident wrecked his spine. Surgeries followed. In 2020, he went public with a Parkinson's diagnosis. No cryptic statements, just, this is what's going on. Tours became question marks. He'd announce dates, then cancel. Plan a comeback, then relapse into pain. To some fans, it felt like emotional whiplash. To Ozzy, it was survival math. Do as much as the body allows. Stop when it threatens to end you. Watching clips from those late-era performances is emotional. Less sprinting, more planted stance, micro movements instead of sprints. But the voice, that torn sandpaper wail, still cut. He wasn't pretending to be 25. He was inviting you to see what perseverance actually looked like. On stage, he'd grin like a kid who'd snuck out past curfew, grateful every time a crowd screamed back. He could have vanished and protected the myth. He chose to keep showing up, bruised and honest. That decision, to remain visible while vulnerable, made the final years feel like a masterclass in dignity wrapped in distortion. If live shows grew harder, the studio became his playground again. In 2022, patient number 9 arrived. Layered, weird, ambitious. Guests poured in. Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, Zakk Wylde, and younger names who grew up with his posters on their walls. The title track felt like an admission and a joke. Ozzy, as the eternal inpatient, poked, prodded, still screaming. Critics expected nostalgia. They got craft. The Grammys noticed, handing him Best Rock Album and Best Metal Performance in 2023. Proof that even as his body rebelled, his creative engine still fired. A few years earlier, he'd teamed up with Post Malone on Take What You Want, bridging metal and hip-hop, without acting like a guest in his own house. That collaboration wasn't Ozzy chasing relevance, it was relevance chasing him. There were whispers in 2024 that he was tracking vocals for yet another project, because why quit when the mic still works? The studio had always been safer than the stage. There he could sit, focus, build songs like fortresses against the silence creeping in. Patient number 9 wasn't a send-off record, it was a reminder. Don't count him out until he's dirt. And even then, good luck shutting him up. July 5th looked celebratory. Lights low, band tight, Ozzy throwing horns with shaking hands. No farewell speeches, no this is it theatrics, just songs, a grin, and that feeling in the pit of your stomach you only recognize in hindsight. 17 days later, the statement hit. Ozzy Osbourne had passed at 76. Phones exploded, timelines flooded, radio stations switched to all Ozzy programming within hours. Fans flooded Birmingham with candles and old vinyl sleeves. In Los Angeles, his star on the Walk of Fame vanished under black roses and hand-drawn crosses. Streaming numbers spiked so hard that services issued press notes about it. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag thank you Ozzy, Prince of Darkness. Hashtag see you on the other side. Artists from metal icons to pop stars posted tributes, some long, some just a single line. The honor was mine. For many, it wasn't the music alone. It was what he represented. Permission to be messy, loud, inconsistent, real. The grief felt personal because Ozzy always felt personal. You didn't watch him from a distance. You felt like you were in the blast radius with him. Loss turned into action overnight. Birmingham city officials started drafting a public memorial. Talk of a statue, a renamed square, maybe even an annual festival on the date of his first gig. Rumors of a Wembley Stadium tribute show began circulating, a rotating lineup of the bands he influenced and the legends who shared his stages. Label execs raided archives, unreleased demos, scribbled lyric sheets, footage from half-forgotten tours. Deluxe editions practically assembled themselves. Online, fans organized a petition for a posthumous knighthood, an honor talked about for years but never granted. Signatures piled up by the hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, whispers of a Sharon-penned memoir grew louder, focusing on the final decade. The surgeries, the studio sessions, the private wins nobody saw. Talk of a foundation surfaced. Mental health support, addiction recovery, music education. The causes Ozzy openly backed when he started making peace with his past. Tribute broadcasts were pitched. Simultaneous shows in London, LA, Sao Paulo. Even artists outside metal lined up, because Ozzy didn't just belong to one genre, he belonged to anyone who ever felt out of place. Legacy isn't a plaque on a wall, it's the machine that keeps running after you're gone. And this machine roared to life immediately. Here's the hard truth. Heavy metal doesn't need one figurehead to exist. It never did. But Ozzy was the most visible, the most resilient, the one who kept climbing back after the fall no one else would have stood up from. Bands like Ghost, Slipknot, Avenged Sevenfold, Bring Me the Horizon, they all point to him as a blueprint. Not the sound necessarily, the permission. Permission to be theatrical, to be vulnerable, to mix menace with humor, to admit fear while screaming over a wall of amps. With Ozzy gone, the genre loses its clearest example of survival through self-sabotage and self-awareness. The next generation inherits the noise and the responsibility to stay weird, to stay honest, to keep pushing volume where culture wants quiet. The future won't look like Sabbath in 1970 or Ozfest in 1999. It'll look like 1,000 micro scenes, kids in bedrooms with cracked guitars and cracked voices, finding new ways to turn anxiety into art. And they'll do it knowing someone did it first, badly, beautifully, publicly. Ozzy Osbourne never tried to be a monument. He tried to be alive, loudly. He took alienation and made it communal. He turned personal collapse into public confession, not for glory, but because it was the only way he knew how to function. He made mistakes, admitted them, asked for another shot. He won, he lost, he kept showing up. That's the philosophy he leaves behind. Be loud, be broken, be fearless, be you. The Prince of Darkness is gone, sure, but the spirit he embodied, defiant survival, messy honesty, joyful noise, doesn't leave with him. It spreads, it mutates, it finds new throats to scream through. So play the songs louder tonight. Tell the story to someone who missed it. And if there's another icon whose saga feels twisted, untold, or misunderstood, drop their name. Because these stories don't end, they just change narrators. Ask 1,000 fans what Ozzy meant and you won't get the same answer twice. One guy will talk about blasting Mr. Crowley in a busted Ford on the way to a night shift. A woman will show you the lyric tattoo she got after crawling out of her worst spiral. A kid in Brazil will say he found Ozzy on YouTube, thought the Bat story was hilarious, then stayed for the honesty in interviews that sounded like his own head. That's the secret core. He gave permission. Permission to admit you're a mess and still take up space. Permission to laugh at yourself without turning your past into a cute anecdote. Permission to love something loud and weird in a world that rewards being quiet and normal. Industry people talk about metrics, ticket sales, streams, merch. Ozzy did all of that. But what he really moved was comfort zones. He forced the mainstream to stare at a guy who didn't fit the poster template and say, yeah, that's a star. He forced metalheads to accept pop culture attention without softening the edges. He taught younger artists that vulnerability isn't weakness if you own it before anyone weaponizes it. And when the demons came back, and they always did, he addressed them aloud so fans wouldn't feel alone facing theirs in silence. Think about the eras he survived: the vinyl age, MTV's golden years, the grunge wave, nu metal, reality TV, streaming, social media. Most artists dig into one lane and never leave. Ozzy shape-shifted without ever ditching the core. The hair changed, the collaborators changed, trends shifted, but the through line stayed. Speak plainly, sing like your throat has ghosts in it, and let life's absurdity show on your face. That's why the tributes cut across genres. Rap producers citing his melodies, EDM DJs sampling Crazy Train, pop singers calling him an influence, not because of the sound, but because of the stance. You can't fake that kind of cultural cross-pollination. It happens because people recognize truth wrapped in theatrics, because showmanship without sincerity dies fast, and sincerity without showmanship gets ignored. Ozzy threaded both on instinct. There's a reason academics are starting to write papers framing him as a cultural translator. He didn't just export heavy metal, he converted alienation into anthems regular people could hum. Black Sabbath scared critics at first because the music sounded like a factory meltdown, but lyrically, it was blue-collar dread dressed in riffs. Decades later, Ozzy was still doing the same job in new clothes, taking chaos and turning it into a chorus before it ate him alive. Plenty tried to copy the shock factor. Almost nobody could mimic the transparency. And then there's the family aspect people underestimate. The Osbournes showed a version of fame where the kitchen was messy, the dogs barked, and the dad asked where the remote was. Except the dad was a global icon who once fronted a band that practically invented doom metal. That contradiction made him human in a world that keeps polishing idols into statues. Posthumously, Sharon's already fighting to make sure that humanity doesn't get flattened into headline highlights. The bat, the drugs, the awards. The real story lives in the in-betweens. The apologies, the rehab relapses, the goofy dad jokes, the moments he told a shaking fan, "You'll be all right, mate. Trust me." The petitions, the tributes, the deluxe box sets, those will all come. The headlines will cycle. But the real legacy is smaller and louder at the same time. A teenager in a bedroom somewhere, volume 2 high, reading an interview where Ozzy says he almost gave up a dozen times and deciding not to give up tonight. That's the echo that won't fade. And if you strip away the myth, what's left is the line he lived by without ever writing it down: survive loudly. Everything else, the thrones, the trophies, the TV shows, is garnish. The meal was a life lived at full blast, even when the speakers were blown. Here's the part nobody can package for you. What happens next is on the listeners. Legends fade when people stop arguing about them, stop sharing the deep cuts, stop telling the messy stories that made them feel seen. If Ozzy's noise ever dragged you through a bad night, repay that debt forward. Recommend a track, start a band, shout down the voice that says you're too weird or too late. Volume is a choice. Community is a choice. Survival is a choice. Make them loudly. That's the tribute he actually earned.